Uh, Welcome, all of you, on this lovely day here in the Berkshires. I'm delighted that you have come back for class number 3 of this 4-part series, Resilience in the Face of COVID-19. COVID-19, yes, no, can't read today, 19. I thought that we might begin with some good news based on empirical research for those of us who are on the older end of the demographic here in the Berkshires. You may remember that I expressed my gratitude to all of you last week when I talked about the fact that one of the ways to find meaning is, in the face of uncertainty, is to do something that gives us meaning, and that may come through sharing. And for me, I really do believe it's come through sharing both what I know and what I have learned recently in the course of preparing for these sessions. And here's something I just learned. Whoops. Well, now what's wrong? Oh, before I get, goodness. Let me do a preview before I share this. I don't know why I'm struggling today in a way that I haven't before, but let us talk for a moment about what we will do in the next 90 minutes. We'll talk about emotional intelligence, and spoiler alert, the good news is that as people age, their emotional intelligence increases around age 60 and up. So that's my little good news piece. I'll tell you about the study in a minute. We'll then look at being locked down together and some of the stresses that are caused by being together 24/7, something many of us have not been used to until we've faced this shutdown / quarantine. And in talking about that, we'll talk about Gottman's 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. All of these are characteristic of people who are struggling with relationships, which of course many people are, given that we have this enforced closeness with just a few people, in contrast to the freedom that we had prior to the pandemic. We'll then go on and talk about quarantine, a little bit of history of quarantine and what is known about people's reactions to it. We'll talk about the impact on kids, the impact on teenagers, and boy, that's a tough one. You may have noticed if you have teenagers at home, or if you're a teenager yourself. We'll talk about online learning. We'll talk about social emotional learning, and for that, I'm very, very pleased that Brooke Bridges has joined us today. So now let me share my little bit of good news for people who are older, and it is that older people are better than their younger counterparts at seeing the positive side of stressful situations and empathizing with people who are less fortunate. And this comes from a study led by Robert Levinson at UC Berkeley. Levinson and his colleagues are tracking how our emotional responses change as we age. And their results indicate that our emotional intelligence and cognitive skills appear to sharpen as we enter our 60s, which gives older people an advantage, perhaps in the workplace, certainly in terms of their personal relationships. In late life, the meaning of life centers on our relationships and caring for others, as well as being cared for by them. And it just may be that evolution has tuned our nervous system in ways that are optimal for acquiring compassion as we age. In one study done by a student of Levinson's, about 150 healthy adults reacted to movie clips depicting sad, neutral, or disgusting scenes. And they were asked to view those scenes through one of three lenses. One, detached appraisal, kind of standing back and looking at the scene neutrally. Another, positive reappraisal, or finally, behavioral suppression, kind of clamping down on their emotional responses. And what they found was that older people were best at reinterpreting negative scenes in positive ways, especially when they were using positive reappraisal. Now, positive reappraisal is a coping measure that relies heavily on life experience and lessons learned. And the older we are, the more time we have to acquire experience and learn more lessons. When I was a teenager, I thought there would come a point when I would be finished. Well, what I've learned across the decades is apparently one never is. Younger and middle-aged participants in this study used detached appraisal to tune negative things out and divert their attention away from unpleasant films. So that's a little good news, something to look forward to as time goes on. Here are some older adults who are better at seeing the positive side of stressful situations. Turns out that older adults are sensitized to sadness. Now, part of this is, of course, part of life. Increased sensitivity to sadness with age is a result of shared experience of sadness, leading to greater intimacy in interpersonal relations. So many times older people talk about having learned a lesson later in life about how important relationships are. And they often observe that they're sorry they didn't quite get that in their younger years. Interestingly, heightened sensitivity to sadness does not increase the risk of depression among older people, but instead is a sign of health. Sadness can be particularly meaningful later in life when we are inevitably confronted with and must deal with losses in our own lives, and of course, the need to give comfort to other people. Lockdown together. A lot of us had this fantasy that it would be absolutely wonderful to be able to spend more time with the people we care most about. And then, thanks to COVID-19, that became more of a reality than we anticipated. The result for many of us were that little irritants have become really magnified. Disruption of routine is difficult, and these little irritants, when you're with somebody all of the time, suddenly become a much bigger deal. Maybe the way your partner chews, or your children nag, or your partner sleeps is irritating. And the more people you're locked down with, the more tempers may flare. There's no question that working remotely is a challenge, homeschooling is a challenge, and you may feel bad about feeling bad. Kind of guilty. Why am I complaining? I don't have it as bad as so-and-so, whoever so-and-so might be. Don't judge yourself too harshly. Research suggests that the more we allow ourselves to feel negative emotions when they arise, the more quickly they disappear. John Gottman, who is an authority on marriage and divorce and an internationally recognized researcher and therapist, has suggested these four, what he calls horsemen of the apocalypse, in the course of trying to understand and predict the things that disrupt relationships and lead to divorce. And I'm sure you've heard on a variety of social media outlets that people are anticipating there will be a rise in divorce as a consequence of our being forced by the pandemic into a kind of closeness that perhaps we have not anticipated. And there are the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Let me just briefly characterize them and tell you a little bit about how they function according to Gottman. The first is criticism, and criticism is not necessarily constructive, and Gottman is not talking about a gentle reminder, but rather the kind of criticism that is an attack on the character of one's partner. Criticism is more than a complaint. It might take the form of, you never think about how your behavior affects other people. You say you forgot, but in point of fact, you're just selfish. You don't think of other people. You don't think about me. Criticism, when it's delivered in the tone of voice that I just used, makes the recipient of the criticism feel as though he or she is under assault. Their reaction is one of hurt. They feel rejected. And it often escalates, becomes more intense, and leads to contempt. Contempt is mean. Contempt is mocking, name calling, eye rolling. There you go again. The recipient of contempt feels despised and worthless. And it places the attacker in a position of moral superiority over the person under attack. Partners who are locked into a relationship filled with contempt for one another are more prone, according to research results, to suffer from infectious illnesses due to weakened immune systems. Remember, the mind and the body are inextricably entwined. And defensiveness involves feeling unjustly accused, searching frantically for excuses to justify whatever one is being criticized for, or playing innocent. Defensiveness is a very common response to criticism, but usually our efforts don't work because the accuser sees the excuse as a failure for the one who is accused to take responsibility for her or his behavior. So, for example, you might ask your partner, "Did you call your sister to tell her we cannot Zoom with her at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning?" To which your partner might reply, "No, you know I was busy homeschooling our children and you were sitting on your butt reading most of the afternoon. Why didn't you do it? You never follow through." Sound a little familiar? Defensiveness escalates the conflict. If the critical partner does not back down or apologize. And if you stop and think about it, defensiveness is actually a way to blame your partner. And here's one of my favorite cartoons. Why do you always get defensive whenever I attack you? And finally, the fourth horseman of the divorce apocalypse, according to Gottman, is stonewalling. Stonewalling takes two forms. It may involve total shutdown. It's a response to contempt, and it occurs when the listener withdraws, just plain shuts down. Or it takes the form of flooding. And when we flood with adrenaline, remember flight or fight, that rush of the stress hormone cortisol, when we're flooded, we can't be rational. So if you flood, don't try to have a discussion, but take a break. 20 minutes should do it. Go for a little walk, outside. If it's raining, just go upstairs, walk around upstairs, etc., before you come back to re-engage. Interestingly, research suggests that happy couples are just as likely as unhappy ones to get angry with one another, as frequently, in fact. The key, however, to whether those couples, and it doesn't have to be a couple, it can be a roommate or the others that you are locked down with, the key is how the individuals react to anger. Happy resolution involves a bid for connection. The two individuals following the tension make an effort to reconnect. They turn toward one another, not away. So let's now take a look at the impact of quarantine. This is, as we all know, a stressful time. We're beginning to come out of it with partial openings of a variety of venues. And if we think back to a couple of weeks ago, when we were waiting for our release from sheltering in place and a very uncertain future, which, as we know, could return depending on what happens, we were quarantined. Or a nicer word for it, I guess, is sheltering in place. And the separation of people who have potentially been exposed to a contagious disease to see if they are or will become ill and prevent them from affecting others is, of course, the reason for separation. And I see signs as I move around Berkshire County that talk about if you're coming in from outside the county and that you should quarantine for 14 days. The origin of quarantine dates all the way back to the 1100s when in Italy, people were quarantined to prevent the spread of leprosy. And then later on, quarantine was used in the face of the Black Death. And then 300 years later, it was used for the plague in the United Kingdom. And in 2003, quarantine was used as a measure to combat the spread of SARS in China and Canada, and in 2014, the spread of Ebola in West Africa. The psychological symptoms related to quarantine are now fairly well known. Immediately after release, researchers find symptoms of acute anxiety, and one thing that we all need to be aware of is that these effects are quite long-lasting. We don't just snap back immediately. For example, in one study, the mean post-quarantine anxiety scores of children quarantined with their parents in Australia during an equine flu epidemic were 4 times higher than the anxiety scores of children who were not quarantined. And even more tellingly, 3 years after hospital staff quarantine, there were clear signs of depression. A more recent study has found clear signs of depression 3 years after Katrina, a natural disaster, which of course resulted in anxiety and depression for people who were living in New Orleans when that disaster struck. So the impact of quarantine is going to be with us for some time, the psychological impact, and then of course there is the economic impact as well. When we deprive people of liberty, it has a negative impact. And public health officials are aware of this. So it's important that they make the experience as tolerable as they possibly can by telling people what's happening and why the quarantine is necessary, by explaining as best they can how long people can anticipate that it will continue, by providing meaningful activities in which people can engage during quarantine, and by reinforcing a sense of altruism for people who do comply. And we've seen all of these things as the quarantine and shutdown, lockdown period has become extended. Public health officials have struggled to give exact time and dates for release. And of course, in light of this virus, they don't have clear data that allows them to do that, which has promoted uncertainty. So many creative efforts have arisen to provide activities for people to engage during quarantine. Many of them, as we know, online. And the list is right now almost endless. I'm going to give you some resources in a few minutes. And in terms of reinforcing the sense of altruism for compliance, I think the most effective messages have been those that underscore that complying with mask wearing and quarantine is certainly about you, but perhaps even more importantly, about protecting others. That's the altruism piece. Researchers have found that if the quarantine experience is negative, then it puts the healthcare system in jeopardy. The amount of exposure or the dose of quarantine is the poison. And we know this from studies about the degree or length of exposure to other kinds of crises, such as war during childhood, which gives us a picture of how much children may suffer from this experience. And the research that has been done on the impact of pandemics is not only true of wartime situations, but also, for instance, post 9/11. Children who lived in Manhattan below Canal Street had 4 times the rate of psychiatric and physical health disorders than children who lived across the bridge in Queens. So the amount of exposure is a critical factor, and the length, of course. Children with the most direct exposure are, not surprisingly, the most at risk. Children who have lost a loved one, a parent or a grandparent to COVID-19. Or even if not resulting in death, a family member ill with the disease. Or not having enough to eat because of the economic consequences, or anxiety related to financial concerns within the household because of furloughing. Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna, who followed in her father's footsteps into psychiatry, did a number of studies and wrote a book on the impact of war on children in the early 1940s. She looked at the results of the war on children in England during 1940 and 41, and found that there were some keys, some critical keys to resilience. You may remember that during that war, the Second World War, in England, children were often sent to the countryside because of the Blitz in the major cities, particularly London. And Anna Freud found that the most resilient children were children who were embedded in a network of support. Either they left the more dangerous areas with parents, but it didn't have to be a parent. It could be a caring parent figure or with siblings. The presence of a calm adult may even reduce the levels of cortisol, which is that stress chemical that is released when people are anxious or fearful. And we now have reason to believe that there's an inoculation effect that enters in over time. You know, an inoculation is a little bit of stress, which then leads to an increase in the ability to deal with subsequent stressors, just like being inoculated for, once it's available, a vaccine for COVID-19 as a protection. One of the reasons that a parent or a caring adult or siblings comprise approximately equal sources of social support is that, interestingly, research has found that children and parents are only in tune about 30% of the time. Does that surprise you? I know when my son was young, I was absolutely sure I was much more in tune with him than less than half the time. But I think in light of the research I've read, I was wrong. One thing we do know clearly is that the enduring lessons for children will be emotional ones. And then there are teens. And if you have teens at home, or if you have teenage or young adult grandchildren, one of the things that you are probably acutely aware of is how wired they are to connect with their peers and how resistant they are to be prevented from doing that. Evolutionary psychologists actually suggest that that hard wiring may come from, as I said, evolution, in that once, and we see this even with animals, once animals are adult enough to get along on their own, they're often kind of shunted from the protection of their parents in order to allow a new litter to be born, for instance. And in order to survive, they rely on peers. That's not always the case, but it's often the case. In any event, it would appear that teens are not built for isolation. Teenagers and young adults are much more attuned to social status than others. And because that's true, isolation is even more distressing for them than for people who are either a good deal younger or a good deal older. And if there's anything they really dislike, it's feeling infantilized when they're treated like children. So, persuading them to shelter is not an easy task. One thing you can do is appeal to their desire to get out from under adult control by turning them into allies, giving them a way to contribute to the household, for example, in meaningful ways, allowing them to manage themselves rather than telling them what to do, and asking them perhaps to help with adult work. Look familiar? Does to me. How can we do this? Well, one thing we can do is to use non-controlling, non-directive language, such as, what's your plan for the day? And to acknowledge that this situation is a really tough one. Tough for everyone. Maybe asking them, what do you care most about in this crisis? Who do you think you might be able to help? Who might you harm? Like visiting your grandparents is off limits because they are more vulnerable. And then engaging them around their role in the pandemic by asking them questions such as, what will you tell your grandchildren about this time in your life? I really thought about that last night because a close friend of mine has 2 grandchildren. Her daughter and her oldest son have same age kids, both of whom are graduating from high school this year, and of course looking forward to move on to college next year. And I sent both of them text messages because I'm trying to be with it enough and not send e-cards because they don't look at email, they just look at texts, congratulating them and telling them that I'm sorry that the world is so upside down that there was no real graduation for either of them, no prom, etc., even though they have found some ways to celebrate. And this is something that StoryCorps will be recording decades from now when they tell their own grandchildren what it was like to live during the COVID-19 pandemic. The take-home message here is let the teenagers step up. Some of you, either parents or grandparents or siblings, may be helping kids to learn online. And the best way to do that is to set up a school at home, plan the day, and keep in mind that very young children can't focus for a long period of time on a task. 10 to 15 minutes is about right for 7, 8, 9-year-olds. So you have to change things up pretty regularly. I told you I would give you some resources. And as I said, there are an enormous number of resources out there. And they're free. So if you have access, here are a few. Facebook, amazing educational resources. On Google, there are teacher-approved apps. Scholastic free resources includes 20 days of lessons for grades pre-K to 9. And Beanstalk has free classes in art and in science for children up to the age of 6. You can play free read-alouds. Mondays, for example, with Michelle Obama. We Are Teachers is another platform, or Kidlit TV. You can watch free webinars, such as the Khan Academy or TED Ed. You can listen to free audiobooks and podcasts. Audible Stories is one source. Pinna is another. And there are free ebooks on Epic and Twinkle. Lots and lots of online resources to choose from. And they provide a lot of variety as well, which is really important to keep young minds engaged. Get physical. Kids Pop YouTube channel has dance-along videos. Ballet Hispanico offers dance lessons on Instagram. And then there's Tinkergarten, which engages kids in gardening activities. And kids do love to play in the dirt. And it's an opportunity to infuse a little science lesson as they watch things grow. There are also ways to stimulate creativity. Hello Bello is on Instagram. You can also find Stay Home Sing Together if your children enjoy singing, or the Lion King experience, or Girls Garage. Again, an endless or nearly endless number of choices. And then, of course, there's educational screen time. Common Sense Media is probably the best source of documentaries for kids, and IMBD educational movies. And the purveyors of these things, these educational opportunities have been so extraordinarily generous by making so many options available online for free, for kids as well as for adults. One aspect of educating children is not only an academic knowledge-based aspect, but also involves paying attention to children's social emotional learning. Because enhancing academic rigor is not enough. In fact, focusing only on what have you learned? Remember when your parents ask you that every day? What did you learn in school today? It was decades ago, but boy, I remember hating that question. And so now I am very pleased to introduce Brooke Marie Bridges, who is going to talk with us about social emotional learning. And I'm going to switch over to her in just a moment, but first I want to tell you a little bit about her. Brooke grew up as a child actress in Los Angeles and encountered mental health challenges like self-esteem issues, anxiety, and depression as a child and moving into teenage years. And as she began her journey to heal, she realized that speaking her truth was one of the primary ways to restore her emotional health. A story of resilience. Brooke now works as a mental health speaker for youth going into schools to share her story with them and to inspire young people to do the same. She's currently developing a social emotional curriculum, Building Bridges SEL, based on storytelling, which ties tangible social emotional learning skills to the personal narratives of young people to promote their resilience and thriving. Brooke, I think you'll have to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you, Ginny, for the introduction. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for including me in the conversation. So yeah, my emphasis is on social emotional learning, and there's a particular curriculum that I focus on the most, and it's CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. It's one of the biggest companies out there. It's evidence-based social emotional learning curriculum. I'll just type it into the chat box. And I follow the 5 components of SEL in the social emotional learning curriculum. And these are important skills for everybody, whether you're an adult or a child, but these are things that we really need to teach our children because we generally just don't get this in school. Like Ginny was mentioning earlier, you know, academia is the primary focus. And if you cultivate these social emotional skills within yourself, your academic, you know, performance will automatically boost. And that's just proven with studies and clinical trials. So the first 2 components are self-awareness and self-management. So self-awareness obviously is being able to understand our strengths and our limitations. It is also identifying our unique personalities, our environment and bodies, and our lifestyles. It helps us recognize our emotions, our thoughts, our values, and how they may impact our behavior. And something that I've also realized is a part of self-awareness is also understanding our brains and our stages of development, because we tend to think that kids are not capable of understanding brain development, but it's not true as long as we express it in ways that they can understand. So I'm also going to put a book by Dr. Daniel J. Siegel. It's called The Whole Brain Child, and that's pretty much what he talks about. He talks about brain development, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I brought storytelling into the social emotional learning curriculum in a second. So some of the things that I have come to see for self-awareness and being able to cultivate that in children and really in yourself, in your own perception, your own awareness of your child and also of yourself, is rating. So, you know, when your kid comes home, oh, how's your day? Oh, fine. Like, you don't really get much out of that question. So I actually work with a clinician. His name is John Madelman. And one of the things he tells the parents, because I do parent and staff trainings as well, is instead of asking your kid how they're doing, ask them how they are on a scale of 1 to 10. And you don't even, you know, just 1 is not so great and 10 is good. And then you can start charting it on a calendar. So you can recognize, you know, when your child is more distressed versus when they're feeling better. And then especially with the quarantine, that will give you the ability to create a schedule around when they're more capable of learning. So before the quarantine, you know, it might be, John always mentions his son who had terrible anxiety, who would always be on a really low, below 5 or below on Sundays, because he knew that he had to get up in the morning and go to school, and school was very anxiety inducing for him. So on Sundays, that was self-care day for his son. That was the day they'd make his favorite dinner. That was the day they wouldn't talk about academics at all. And his performance in academia and in sports and just his overall mood really improved because they were keeping an eye on when his, you know, emotional triggers were higher versus when they were lower. So yeah, keeping track of it on a calendar is a good idea. And then as they get older, you can have them be a part of that. So, you know, have them have a diary card and a diary book, especially for kids who experience anxiety and depression on a more intense level, so for some kids who have actually gotten diagnosed and stuff, it's a good practice for them to start tracking their own emotional, internal world than just having you do that for them. So the second one is self-management. Self-management is obviously, how we manage our own emotions, how we mitigate impulsive reactions to our emotions, and how to develop skills to overcome emotional challenges. So all the stuff that we figure out during our self-awareness step, how do we then manage some of the more negative things that come up? So one of the activities I like to do for myself, really, and I also offer to kids, is like a time in during meltdowns instead of a time out. So teaching that, expressing anger is okay. I think Jenny mentioned that earlier too. Like, it's okay to feel bad. It's okay to have moments of anger. And we forget that as children, they are also entitled to those experiences of anger and frustration. And so if you can communicate that by pointing out, usually for kids, it's somatic. So what it feels like in their body, and you can see it when you look at them, their faces are clenched, their fists are clenched, they might turn red, their bodies are shaking, that typical like, that freak out tantrum. And then you can say, I understand you're feeling upset right now. I can see it in your body. I can tell by the way that your face is scrunched, by the way your hands are clenched, and you're speaking really loudly to me. And that gives them the language. So you're modeling that language for them, because all they know is their body feels bad. Their mood feels bad. Maybe they pinched their finger, scraped their knee. Maybe their brother took their toy, whatever the case is, all they know is it doesn't feel good, but they don't necessarily have the language for how to express that to you. So a lot of times it comes out in a temper tantrum. So if you can model that language for them, then later they may even come to you and say, I'm frustrated, I'm having a frustrating time. Or I saw this video actually of a woman who teaches this to her son, and he had to be no more than 3. And he's walking up with a blanket. I'm really frustrated right now, and it was like, because she gave him that language and she allowed him to have experiences of anger and frustration and then tell her so that she can either help. So you can say, would it be helpful for you if I sat here with you and listened? Do you want my advice? Do you want me to support you? Do you need a hug? Do you need a snack? Are you thirsty? Are you tired? Or would you rather just go outside and get some air? Like, allowing them that opportunity even at a young age. And obviously sometimes that doesn't always work, and then they'll continue to break down. But a lot of times you can mitigate that initial temper tantrum with those kinds of self-management skills offered to them. And being able to identify body language and internal sensations, because most of us feel our emotions in our body first. And being able to say, oh, your tummy hurts, maybe you're feeling a little anxious right now, or a little nervous or upset, can help them get that language and become more aware of their bodies. Okay, so the next one, you can go to the next slide, is social awareness. Obviously very important. This is how we become aware of other people's backgrounds and cultures, and understanding other perspectives, and showing empathy and compassion for other people. And this, for me, is where the storytelling part comes in, because I think even in the relationship between a parent and a child, a lot of the goings on in your, the parental life or at work or wherever is not shared with the kids. So you might come home really angry because your boss just said something really rude to you, and all your kid knows is now mom or dad is angry and not very nice, and I don't really know why, and they're taking it out on me. So this is actually a good opportunity to even say, you sit down at dinner and you say, like, man, I'm having a really bad day. My day is so stressful. This person talked to me like this, and being able to just express it, because then again, that models the behavior you want to see. Instead of your kid projecting and blaming and yelling, then they'll say, okay, well, mom told me when she was stressed out, so maybe I can tell her, that I got into a fight with my best friend and now I'm really upset and it makes me want to scream and punch stuff, and then they'll be able to just explain it. And I will also have been talking to a lot of clinicians about the best time to talk to a kid, which if I could see you, I'm sure some of you would be able to pinpoint when this is, but it's actually in the car, because you don't have eye contact. Sometimes kids get nervous about, they start judging the looks on your face, whether or not you're judging them. So being able to sit in the car and driving is one of the best places to have a conversation with usually, especially with an older kid, but with younger kids as well. Okay, and the next slide, relationship skills. So now we have some social awareness. We can understand what other people are going through. They're telling us their stories. Maybe we can empathize and tell them our story. And so relationship skills, how do we have positive reciprocal relationships with other people so that it can help us thrive in all areas of our lives? Relationship skills obviously refer to knowing how to interact with others in order to develop positive peer relationships, acceptance, friendship, and relationship skills also foster a sense of self and confidence, and creates competence in communication and emotional intelligence. Because if you know that you can go into a room and have a discussion with someone, whether it's your parent, your teacher, your best friend, your sibling, you'll just feel more confident in yourself. You'll create that sense of self-agency, which I think a lot of kids lack and a lot of adults lack as well. So a relationship skill that I recently learned is called courageous conversations. And it's something I learned working on this farm that I work at in upstate New York called Soulfire Farm. And, kids aren't any less prone to emotional distress than we are, of course, and they have less skills than we do. So a lot of times, when we were working on this courageous conversation, when I was in staff trainings, was between two adults. But I think it can also be valuable between an adult and a child, because again, we look at kids who are being, dramatic and, oh, you're just being a kid. Why are you sad? Like, that doesn't even make any sense. Like, you trust me, when you get older, you'll understand, it's going to get better. Oh, even things like, oh, you broke up with that boyfriend. It's fine. You'll get over it. Trust me. Like, that's not the one, and stuff like that, where we minimize their experiences, but they've never had the experiences that we have had as adults. So this really allows an opportunity to have these conversations and to not minimize it as just stress, and admitting your own faults in a conversation as well. If you project and yell at your kid, my dad was one of those parents that was just like, well, you're my kid. That's how I talk to you. Suck it up kind of thing. And that's obviously not cool. And that, kind of breaks this feeling of trust between parent and child. And then parents wonder, why is my kid never telling me what's going on? Because you judge them and you yell at them and you don't listen to really what they're saying. So being able to have a courageous conversation and saying, to your kid, when you said this, it made me feel this, the I feel statements. It made me feel like this, and I responded with this because I was really stressed out today, and I feel frustrated that sometimes you don't listen to me, and I feel like you're not listening to me. And then something we also have to understand as adults is the kids' brains are literally not fully developed. Like literally, I experienced this. I don't have any kids of my own yet, but I've spent a lot of time with kids. I study kids. I'm taking developmental psychology right now, and I have nephews, and I have a 5-year-old nephew and an 11-year-old nephew. And one thing I noticed with them is that you can say something and it literally goes through their brain. Not even that they're trying. Some kids do try, but not that they're always trying to ignore me. It's just like you have to take them. Are you listening right now? Okay, so this is what's going on. So if we can remember, oh, their brains are underdeveloped, it honestly takes a lot of stress off of us, because we know that is their capacity. If we expect them to have the same capacity as an adult, we're going to be disappointed every single time. Okay, and then the last one is responsible decision making. So obviously understanding between right and wrong, what, the impact of negative choices, pros and cons, being able to understand the difference between internal factors, and external factors, and then the best way to respond to them in order to avoid negative impacts on ourselves and others. So responsible decision-making teaches problem solving, critical thinking, autonomy and agency, and a personalized motivation skills. So something that I know from my own experience as a kid, and things that I hear from kids that I speak with, is that their parents just do everything for them. You know, Ginny also mentioned this, like not treating them like a child. Kids can make their own decisions to some extent. Obviously, they can't run into the street. You know, we know certain things. It's just like, sorry, that's not one for you to make. But even getting their perspective, even if you yourself know you're going to make the decision regardless, asking them their opinion and telling them the reason why you're doing it is a really small step that brings them into the decision. You don't have to, it doesn't mean that they're going to get what they want. It doesn't mean that they might not have a breakdown if they don't get what they want, but it's a small step that can give them the opportunity to feel like, oh, well, I have an opinion at least that my parents listen to. You know, my dad would just like squash it. He just was raised like that. So he raised me like that. No bad blood. Love my dad so much. And if I hadn't had these experiences with him, I wouldn't even know what I'm talking about right now. So I would just, you know, being able to say, well, I want to do blank, and my parents saying, well, I know you want to do that, but in this case, it makes more sense for us to do this. Do you understand? No, I don't understand. Okay, well, let me know if you'd like to talk about it again later. Maybe you can go take a break, think about it. If it still doesn't make sense, we can talk about it again or not, but I'm sorry, this is just what it has to be. You know, just keeping that conversation going. And I know that especially right now in quarantine, like our patience is very limited. You know, I can't even imagine. I had my nephews for a couple days and was like, whoa, I could see what my sister's going through. It's a lot, it's intense. And then, you know, being able to also cut that then and say, you know, mom needs 5 minutes. You know, I don't want to yell at you. I don't want to be rude to you. And I'm feeling really frustrated and I need to make this decision for myself. So can you please leave me alone? I know with younger kids that might not work out so well, but with older kids, I think it works. And so another way to foster responsible decision-making is, you know, letting them even choose something small, like dinner. You know, they can, and if they're older, they can help cook. Even if they're younger, they can help cook. You know, they can take turns picking the movie for family night. My parents did do that for us when we were little because there were 3 of us, and that was great. It's like, cool, I get to choose the movie that we watch. You know, it felt like I had a little bit of agency in my life and contributed something to the household too. And even something as small as letting kids pick out their own clothes. That also is a big deal, you know, because then they're starting to foster their own sense of identity. So they're, you know, that self-awareness right there and responsible decision-making. And especially with quarantine, it's like, why not? Like they're not actually going anywhere. So if they want to wear Batman cape, which I know some people let their kids wear that even out, which makes me really happy. But it's not that big of a deal, but letting them pick it out for themselves, you know, it builds confidence. And so the last one I have, at least for responsible decision-making, that I think is really helpful for older kids is working out, even younger kids could be okay with this, but I think especially for older kids is working out a schedule with them. So instead of saying, oh, you know, this is your school schedule now, and you have to do this at this time and this at that time, which is honestly one of the big qualms that older kids have with school, is that they don't get to choose when they get to do stuff. Being able to say, all right, let's sit down. Let's go buy some planners together. You're going to buy a planner for 2020. I'll buy a planner for 2020 and we'll write stuff down. And, you know, you can pick like if with their self-awareness, with their scale of 1 to 10, if they feel terrible before lunch because they're so hungry, maybe that's not the best time to work on a subject that is especially hard for them. You know, maybe that's a terrible time to talk about math. Maybe that can wait till after lunch. Or I don't really know how the personal or the online schooling is going to work for the coming year, but I know for people who are homeschooling, it's much easier to alter the schedule like that. So maybe for this kid, they need to get up around 8. You know, some kids can't function with getting up so early. I know for me, that was a huge deal. It's like, the first few hours, I was just, you know, out of just not there in class. And I was a straight A student, but that's challenging. So being able to use their chart, you know, to see when they're in the better mood versus the worst mood. Obviously, if they're in a better mood, they'll be able to learn more effectively, and letting them be a part of that. And then obviously, if there are moments where you just have to do something at a certain time, tell them and explain to them why. I think that's a missing link a lot of times, is like, we don't tell people stuff. We just that's just what it is. I do it too. But like, that's just what it is. Don't ask me why. I also see somebody raised their hand. I don't really know what that means exactly.
Megan, is there a question for Brooke?
I don't see it. Someone raised their hand a while. Oh, who was it?
Rob.
Rob. Yeah, we normally wait till the end of the presentation to address questions. So, and Rob, and we encourage you to use the chat or Q&A function. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yes, being able to have them work out a schedule with you. And so the last part that I want to talk about is the storytelling element of the social emotional curriculum that I'm working out. And the reason why storytelling is beneficial is because for kids, like studies actually show for younger kids, especially, in order for them to connect both sides of their brain, so, you know, the right side of the brain is the creative side, impulsive, emotional. It's like where all of our intensity lies. And the left side of the brain, which I think it's probably opposite on your screen, the left side of the brain is the logical side, the analytical side. And the reason why they have to tell their story is because that's how they build those connections and not only build them, but maintain them and manage them and make them stronger. And so I'm just going to read this little excerpt from Daniel J. Siegel's book, because I found it to be really a great excerpt. So he says, one way we use brain science to really help our children is in making stories that help us make sense and calm our children down. Let's say your daughter falls down and scrapes her knee. One way you can understand what happens there is inside of her. The pain from her knee is going to come up and register itself in the right side of her brain. The feeling of shock and surprise and humiliation even will be in the right side of her brain. And yet, for her to make sense of what happened, she's got to use the left side and link it to the right. So here is a way you can do that. You say to your daughter, wow, I really see what happened. That was really scary because you were running along. You were so excited to see your grandma. You didn't know there was a broom in your way because you were looking at her. And then you tripped. And that was really a shock. And you felt really, really bad, and now your knee really hurts. So something that simple, those moments are ways of teaching her to name that inner experience that she's having, of shock, of pain. And when you do that, the brain uses the process called name it to tame it. When the left hemisphere names what's going on in the right, the whole system calms down. So at this moment, when you've identified what your daughter is experiencing, teaching her how to make sense of what happened, then she feels better, and you're teaching her the exact tools she needs. So when she goes out into life, she'll be able to approach life with gas on resilience because you've taught her how to name it to tame it for anything she encounters in her life ahead. So it seems really simple, but again, we tend to brush off our children and sometimes even ourselves as emotional or overdramatic. So by allowing them and ourselves to share our stories and helping them find the language to do that, which I said before is a part of self-awareness and self-management, then they'll be able to outline what happened, understand it, and validate their emotional experience and identify ways to cope for next time. Because validation piece, the reason why storytelling is so essential is because of that validation piece. A lot of times for ourselves even, instead of saying, wow, this is really painful and really affected me in a negative way, and now I'm in a terrible mood and I just want to lay on the couch all day, instead of letting ourselves say that, we jump straight to a solution. Oh, I should be working out right now. Oh, you have work to do. Just get up. You got to make dinner. You got to do that, and we do it with our kids too. Like, oh, it's okay. Like, it's fine. It's going to be fine, without giving the chance to like validate it. No, that really hurt. I know that really sucks. Like a teenager breaking up with a boyfriend. Ow, that really hurts. It's that simple. And we don't need to say much else other than that. Yep, it really hurts. And one day you will get over it, but let's just sit in that for a second. So that's where the storytelling part is essential. So I'll just recap the 5 components. So there's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And then my curriculum adds on storytelling as an element to help us utilize all of the skills within the 5 key components of social emotional learning. So I think Is that a good
Great.
timing?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
perfect.
Thank you for letting me share.
Oh, Brooke, thank you so very much.
Yeah, of course.
Really appreciate your insights. So from a broad perspective, integrating social emotional learning into lessons, whether they're online or face-to-face, is, if you step back, an effort to build a community and culture of connection and commitment, in contrast to the old-fashioned, a culture of compliance. Do what you're told. Take your pen out and write for 5 minutes, or whatever the instruction might be. And the keys for integrating social emotional learning into any class, whether online or face-to-face, is when you're thinking about your lesson plans, keep social emotional learning in mind. And there are 3 ways to enhance community and promote academic engagement. One of them involves the welcoming ritual. I know I've met Brooke. I originally met Brooke as part of a Working Cities meeting in Pittsfield, and the initiative director, Alyssa Costa, has a welcoming ritual. It's not really a class, but this is an example of a ritual. She goes around the room and asks everyone to simply give their name and they're new and good. What's new with you? That's good. Very short, but allows everyone to speak just for a tiny fraction of the meeting, and it is something that everyone comes to expect will be part of getting together at Working Cities. Another is to find strategies to engage people who you are teaching. And that might come in the form, as Brooke just mentioned, of a co-creation of goals. You get a calendar for 2020, I'll get a calendar for 2020, and we'll both keep track and negotiate. That's engagement. And finally, optimistic closures, leaving on a note of optimism, which, by the way, preview of coming attractions, we're going to do in this course next week, because I'm going to spend the time I have with you next week talking about the silver linings that may emerge from this pandemic, with its enforced shutdown, economic uncertainty, personal uncertainty, etc. It is providing us, and we'll talk about the ways in which this pause may result in beneficial changes. So if you're doing teaching face-to-face at home, or helping with online, it's important for you as the teacher to develop your own social emotional learning practices by welcoming diverse perspectives and displaying that for those you are, quote, teaching. As Brooke talked about, letting your kids understand, or the children you're working with, that they're not the only ones with strong emotions. You have them too, and explaining what they are. and why you're perhaps a little grumpy at dinner. And something we talked a lot about last week, practicing compassion toward yourself. And finally, Brooke referred to the fact that we have to be mindful that children's brains are not totally developed if we're engaged in teaching them. We want to incorporate into our efforts to teach opportunities for us to reflect and for them to provide feedback, and then for us to share our own thoughts about the feedback we receive, to provide evidence perhaps of what was learned the day before we start into something new, and finally to name how today's lesson should lift them up and build upon what they learned the day before. And don't forget brain breaks. Young children need frequent changes of pace. It might be stretching, it might be quiet time, it might be a 2-minute meditation of the kind that we practiced in the first class. So I'm going to just move on. I promised that I would give you some resources to share. Next week, as I said, we're going to talk about silver linings and some lessons to remember when lockdown ends, even modified lockdown, which is what we're seeing now. So I'm going to flip through a few slides. I'll incorporate them next week, but I'm going to move then to just show some resources on the screen. And Megan, if there are questions for me or for Brooke, we could talk about them now. And here are the resources.
Great. So Brooks addressed some of the questions that were on here, which is wonderful. And at the beginning, let's see, Linda Morris Kelly noted that parents in the West Side neighborhood of Pittsfield said last Monday evening that they are really feeling the stress of being quarantined for such a long time with their kids. And the kids are stressed always being with their parents, especially the older kids. So. And there was just a lot of interest in the topic and also in finding out more about Brooke, so I put her website in there as well.
Great. It's also on one of the slides, I think.
Great.
Also, I know somebody had their hand raised. I think it was Rob a little while ago. Not sure.
I sent Rob a message asking him or her to put their message in chat.
Okay.
Anything else?
That's it.
Well, here, Neurodharma is a book that I think people might find helpful. It's by Rick Hansen. Another book by Kristen Neff on self-compassion, step by step. Marty Seligman's The Hope Circuit, a psychologist's journey from helpless to optimism. Robert Amen's The Little Book of Gratitude. Nina Sirvanison's Social Emotional Learning Every Day. Gigi Renee Hill's Self-Care Check-In. And positivepsychology.com is a website where you can get into contact with Martin Seligman's work and his PERMA model and take a variety of questionnaires. If you'll remember the first week of the class, I ask you to take the Authentic Happiness questionnaire. It is on that website out of University of Pennsylvania, where Seligman and his colleagues are doing their work, their positive psychology focus. And then here you have the Castle website finally as well.
Great. And we have one last question that came in from Brian Harrison. He asks if you can explain what flooding is part of stonewalling.
Oh, stonewalling is, you know, just sort of shutting down, and it may be a consequence of flooding, which is that adrenaline rush that so overwhelms you, the stress hormone cortisol, that you just, it's the deer caught in the headlights. You know, you're sort of stopped in your tracks. You can't hear what's being said to you, and you're just not able to continue any kind of rational conversation. And that should be a sign. That's the physiological side of shutting down. And it's a good time to take a break. And as I said, 20 minutes, maybe a little walk, withdraw, etc. But don't try to stay there and continue the conversation, because it probably won't go well if you do. So Brooke, again, thank you so much. The rest of you, be well, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.